Welcome to this e-lecture, which is concerned with the so-called Skopos rule of translation. Skopos is a Greek word which means purpose, aim, or function. Let's start by having a look at this quote by the famous German translation theorist Hans Vermeer. He said, "Translate, interpret, speak, write in a way that enables your text or translation to function in the situation in which it is used and with the people who want to use it and precisely in the way they want it to function." This quote really captures the essence of the theory. It basically tells you that translation is, and should be, a purpose-driven activity. In other words, when people translate texts out there in real life, they always do so for some kind of purpose. In connection with a specific translation task, then, the important thing is to ascertain what is the specific purpose of this particular translation task that I have been asked to do. What that means is that you should never simply start by translating. You should always start by asking yourself, what is my target text going to be used for? Who is going to read it, and for what purpose? You need to answer these questions in order to know how to go about actually translating the source text. Now, fundamentally, we may distinguish between two very different types of translational purposes or situations in which the target text is meant to function. They are called instrumental and documentary translations, respectively. The two situations have very different characteristics when it comes to overtness, the role of the translator, the status of the target text, and the role of the target text reader. Let's start by looking at the translation type that we call instrumental translation, and let's go through the dimensions one by one. First, the question of overtness has to do with whether the target text reader is aware that what he or she is reading is in fact a translation. In the case of instrumental translation, the point is that the reader will either be unaware of or won't care about the fact that he or she is reading a translation. And so we call this a covert translation. Have a look at this text, for example. This is a specimen of a so-called patient information leaflet, which you'll find in the packaging of medicinal products, if you ever buy Madsen. The text contains information about the kind of drug this is, how it works, how to take it, etc. As you can see, this particular text is in Danish, and it is in fact a target text, translated from English. The point is, there is nothing in the text, or for that matter, in the circumstances surrounding the text, to alert you to the fact that it is a translation. The text does not in any way pass itself off as a translation, and that is why we call it covert. Next, we have the dimension called the role of the translator. In the case of instrumental translations, the translator functions as what we call a mediator between primary parties. What does that mean? Well, it means that we have an original sender or addressor who writes a source text on the basis of which a translator writes a translation, a target text, addressed to some kind of receiver or addressee. The point is that when the target text reader reads the text, she will read it as if she is being addressed by the original source text sender. In other words, the translator is creating the illusion, we might say, that the original sender, the source text addresser, is communicating directly with the target text reader. Next, we have the question of the status of the target text. Here we find that the target text usually acquires the same status as the source text. This means, for example, that if the source text is a newspaper article, then the target text will become a real newspaper article also. That is, one that will really be printed in a newspaper and read by actual newspaper readers. Or if the source text is an instruction manual, then the target text will also become a real instruction manual, and so on and so forth. What about the role of the target text reader then? Well, it follows from what I just said about the role of the translator being a mediator between primary parties. It follows from that the target text reader will perceive herself as being addressed directly by the source text sender. In other words, the target text reader will be a real participant in the communication. She will be, for example, a real newspaper reader, a real instruction manual user, a real patient information leaflet user, that is, one who reads the information leaflet because he or she is a patient. Right. Now let's consider the type of translation called documentary translations. Once again, we should start by considering the dimension called overtness. And here, in this type of situation, we find that the translation is overt, meaning the target text reader will be completely aware that the text is actually a translation, possibly because the target text reader was the one who commissioned the translation in the first place. This is very often, but not always, the case in this type of translation. What about the role of the translator then? Well, here the translator will be what we call a communicator of somebody else's communication. So we have an initial source text situation in which an addresser writes a text addressed to some kind of addressee. And we have a very different receiver who needs a target text written by a translator to document what was communicated between the original addresser and the original addressee. Now, to illustrate what I mean, let me tell you a small anecdote, a completely fictitious one, but nonetheless completely realistic. Let's imagine a situation out in Afghanistan, where Denmark still has military forces deployed, engaged in actual combat with the Taliban. The Danish combat troops are accompanied by intelligence officers who are obviously tasked with collecting intelligence about the enemy's plans for future attacks. Now let's imagine that our Danish intelligence officers have managed to intercept some radio communication between two Taliban warriors, one addressing the other about where to put a roadside bomb. Or rather, that is what our Danish intelligence officer suspects to be the subject of that intercepted communication. There is only one problem. The officer doesn't understand the local language spoken in Afghanistan. It's called Pashto. So what does he do? He approaches one of the Danish army's language officers, who is educated in Pashto, and he asks her to make a translation of the radio intercept. The purpose of that translation will be to enable the officer to learn what was communicated between those two Taliban warriors. So I hope you can see how the situation matches the one diagrammed in the slide. Our intelligence officer, who is the receiver, he needs a translation made by the language officer, the translator, and that target text will have the purpose of reflecting in exact detail, probably, what the Taliban warrior number 1 communicated to warrior number 2. Right, and that was the end of the small military anecdote. Now let's go on to the next dimension, the status of the target text. I hope it's clear from my military anecdote that a target text that functions in this type of situation is only a kind of window onto the source text, and that it will have no real status in itself. But it may be used, for example, as evidence in courts, for research and intelligence purposes, in a police investigation, etc. What about the role of the target text reader? Well, once again, it should follow logically from the above that he or she will be an observer or investigator only. Often, as I said earlier, he or she will be the one who commissioned the translation. The target text reader is definitely not the one addressed by the source text writer, and so will not be a real participant in the communication. Once again, that should be quite clear if we return for a brief moment to the military anecdote, where it should be plain that our Danish intelligence officer is definitely not the one addressed by the Taliban warrior. Also, our target text reader would probably prefer to read the source text if he or she had been able to, typically in order to be able to get at the original meaning of the source text. Now, what are we going to use all this for? Well, we need these deliberations to be able to settle on an appropriate macro strategy, that is, an appropriate way of going about translating the source text. In the case of documentary translations, the recommended macro strategy is what we call a source text-oriented one. More specifically, it is a strategy where we stay close to the wording of the source text and where we transfer any culture-specific content from the source to the target text unchanged. And I'll say more about the translation of culture-specific content on a later occasion. Why this so-called source text-oriented approach? Well, because this type of translation serves to document as closely as possible what the source text said. Well, that is why you typically expect a very faithful or literal or word-to-word type of translation. In the instrumental category, on the other hand, the recommended macro strategy is what we call a target text-oriented one. The focus is, or should be, on transferring the message from the source to the target text, but never mind about the exact wordings of the source text. Often, but not always, culture-specific content from the source text may be changed into corresponding target cultural content. We could, for example, imagine an American cultural phenomenon like Disneyland being translated into Tivoli in Danish in this type of situation. As I said, I will say more about the translation of culture-specific content in another lecture.